But I want to introduce my good friend, Jonathan Gruber, who's going to talk to us about faith and science incompatible? Just before he comes up here and shares with us a little bit on that topic, I do want to just say welcome to Theology on Tap and just tell you a little bit about what we're about here. We're about having deep conversations and forming new friendships, talking about things that matter in life and faith, so often that get passed over in other areas of life. Sometimes we don't talk about some of the most important questions that are kind of lingering in our minds and hearts. And so we wanted to create a third space, somewhere outside of work in the home, where we could gather and ask deep questions and talk about them. So I'm excited to have a deep thinker like Jonathan Gruber come talk to us. He's a teacher at Brookwood, but he's so much more than that. He's a good friend on Is Our Faith and Science Incompatible? Welcome, Jonathan Gruber, everybody.
Thank you, Father David. So as he mentioned, I teach at Brookwood School. I teach history and English. So if you don't see the irony of an English and history teacher doing a talk on faith and science, then, well, you should. It's pretty ironic. In fact, I had no idea. The answer to that last question. My master's is in divinity, and as part of that. Journey, a lot of my interest has come on kind of the big questions, the big questions of faith, right? And how do we make sense of our faith in this world? And so that's really the direction that I come from. I really hope what I say tonight will be really uncontroversial. You may want some more controversy, but my hope is actually that what I'm going to say is just like, oh yeah, that's uncontroversial. That makes sense. So. Let me start. World-renowned theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking wrote the following about science and religion. He said by the way, let me pause. There's a handout with several quotes, and it goes in the order of my presentation, so there's kind of some chunky, meaty quotes in here, and so if you want to follow along that way, that'd be fine. So he said there's a fundamental difference between religion, which is based on authority, and science, which is based on observation and reason. Science will win because it works. In this, Hawking seems to suggest that science and faith are completely at odds with each other. One is reasonable, the other is irrational. One has evidence, the other does not. One works, one fails. And that is the perspective of some people in society today and even some scientists today. The years earlier, in 1937, the father of modern physics and the creator of quantum theory, which is one of the most important physical theories of the 20th and 21st century. It is the current understanding of physics that we operate within today. He wrote this. He said, both religion and science need for their activity the belief in God. And then he later wrote this. The one does not exclude the other. Rather, they are complementary and mutually interacting. Man needs science as a tool of perception. He needs religion as a guide to action. And so Planck, who was operating under, really creating, in fact, the same physical worldview that we have today, and on which Hawking has actually built his career, believed that there was no essential conflict between science and faith or belief in God. He thought rather that science and faith were compatible and even complementary. And so it just puzzles me, how is it that two world-renowned scientists in the same field, seeing the same data, having the same modern scientific understanding of the universe, could reach absolutely opposite conclusions about the relationship between science and faith? And I honestly don't know the answer to that. I don't know how these two men came to almost completely opposite understandings. But the question that I do want to spend time is just pondering this question. Has science buried God? Or has science made faith irrational or unreasonable? I hear it put in society sometimes like this. I hear people say, well, with the advancement of science, it's not reasonable anymore to believe in God. Science has made faith obsolete. Or we might put it differently. Can can current 21st century science, what we have working today, and traditional faith in a divine creator, classically understood as all-powerful and all-good, can those things coexist? So before I do that, we're going to get to that. It's not a very long talk. I just want to make a couple of qualifying statements. Number one, actually in this talk the goal of this talk is not to try to prove to anyone that God exists. That's just not my goal here. I personally have a great deal of respect for my thoughtful, my skeptical, my non-religious friends. I have some friends at school, and I've been having some really good conversations with one of them over a lot of these issues, and he's fairly skeptical, and it's neither one of us are trying to convince each other of a particular thing. We just are talking about it, and I love that. I love the dialogue there. And so I have no judgment towards those who have reached different conclusions about ultimate reality than I have. I have respect for people who don't, I have a lot of respect actually for people who don't unreflectively believe things simply because that's what they've been taught or grew up in. But second, as a result of that, I think that's precisely why we probably should be talking about this topic. I wonder if the narrative that science has destroyed the possibility of faith is maybe something that we as a Western culture have unreflectively accepted. And so maybe we need to reflect upon that idea as well. And so that's what we'll do. So has science buried God? Well, yes. To the Marvel fans in this room, I'm sorry to say that if you hoped or believed that Thor, the Norse god of thunder, existed, science has pretty much buried him, okay? And so I know that guy, what's the actor's name? Hemsworth. Thor, the god of thunder, science has basically buried him. Science has also buried the Greek gods like Zeus and Poseidon, gods who were responsible for lightning and earthquake and natural phenomenon, right? The idea of gods that were directly responsible for these certain features of our earth, science, fortunately or unfortunately, has buried that idea. But to be fair, those gods were already buried thousands of years before modern science existed. The Greek philosopher Plato, 2,700 years ago, clearly argued for the unreasonableness of belief in those gods, actually in favor of a belief in a supreme creator. And so science has buried certain kinds of gods. Science has also buried certain beliefs about God and the universe. Now, this may or may not be a controversial statement, so if there is one, this could be it. And we can certainly interact with that in the question and answer session. But the belief that the entire physical universe is a few thousand years old is not a tenable belief based on contemporary science today. And the reason why we know that is we know now that the universe is expanding. And we actually know the rate of expansion. And so we know how to measure the speed of light. And so knowing these calculations, we know that the universe is expanding at a particular speed, and if it's been expanding at a particular speed, then we can simply measure back and get to the beginning. And that gives us a very large number of currently the estimation, and it is still an estimation. Science doesn't work in absolutes, but the estimation is 13.7 billion years, give or take, plus or minus 50 million, okay? And when you kind of see that, that's not a very large number in the realm of 13.7 billion, okay? And so science has made it, and so in some ways, science does make certain kinds of belief about the world unreasonable to hold. But has science made it unreasonable or irrational to have faith in a God such as the one that monotheists hold to exist? The God who is all-powerful, the God who is the creator, the God who is personal. Those are some of the characteristics. I think simply by exploring what science is and what it does, we should see that the answer is just a very obvious no, and I hope you'll see that. So, again, I'm an English teacher, so I don't teach science, but I did happen to look at the AP Biology textbook as I was kind of preparing for this talk, and in the very opening pages, here's how it defines science. It says, science is a way of knowing an approach to understanding the natural world. Okay? That's so important. Science is the project, and it's a very successful project, of observing the physical universe. And you guys know the scientific method, right? It's a very nice process. We make observations. We ask questions about the universe. We then form hypotheses about the universe. And then we produce experiments that will kind of test those hypotheses. And then we collect the data. And often we've got to do that over and over and over again. But it allows us to reach some really strong and solid conclusions about this physical universe. But that's all it can do. It can't answer questions. There's just certain things it can't do. It can't answer questions such as, why is there something rather than nothing, right? That's a question that science can't answer, and it doesn't even pretend to answer that. So it can't answer questions about anything that might be beyond the physical universe. Let me give a quote by Praveen Sethupathi, the professor of genetics at Cornell University. He says, "Science provides a set of tools that are useful for investigating phenomenon in the natural world. But as powerful as it may be for dissecting planetary motion and battling cancer, it's not really intended for questions like, why did life forms originate in the first place? And we're free to speculate, to opine, to have our beliefs, but science is not equipped to answer questions like this." Now, this doesn't itself, and I think this is a fair point, this doesn't itself mean that there is an answer somewhere else. It just means that we have to be faithful to what science is, and that we can't extend the purview of science beyond what it is capable of addressing. And so he's essentially saying science has limits as to what it can do. And one of those limits is the discussion of metaphysical or beyond the physical reality. But for all that science can do, there's actually quite a few limits to what science can tell us, okay? The following list comes from USC Berkeley's Understanding Science website. And I think for those of you who know, USC Berkeley is a premier scientific institution in our world. And so they actually list 4 things that science simply cannot tell us. Number 1, science cannot make moral judgments. It cannot tell us what is right or wrong or why we should live a certain way morally, okay? Number 2, science cannot make aesthetic judgments. It cannot tell us what is beautiful or ugly. Number 3, and this is a very interesting one to me, science cannot tell us how to use scientific knowledge. So it can't tell us, for instance, it can tell us how to create an atomic bomb, but it can't tell us should we have dropped it when we dropped it, right? Or kind of a more recent example, there's this I don't know if you're familiar with it, but CRISPR, have you guys heard of CRISPR? It's this, we now, in the 21st century, it's unbelievable, we have the capability of going in and genetically modifying genes. At the genetic level, we can splice, we can interact with them. We have the potential, it's an amazing, the potentials are amazing. There's the potential to fix genetic disorders at the genetic level, right? I mean, I don't know, that's an unbelievable power that we've developed scientifically now. But science can't tell us how to use CRISPR. It can't tell us whether we should use CRISPR, because there's a lot of ethical considerations should we start using that technology or not. And finally, science cannot draw conclusions about supernatural or metaphysical questions. The website says it's simply not equipped to do that. And I just love that. I love that that website has produced that because they're very real about what science can do and what science cannot do. And so, to just summarize, science can tell us a whole lot about the world. It can tell us how things work. It can tell us how old the universe is. It can tell us, it can estimate how many stars are in the universe. I just found out. This was an amazing, mind-boggling thing. I'll give it to you. It's very interesting. In our Milky Way galaxy, there are 100 billion suns like our sun, right? That's pretty wild, isn't it? That's big. And in the universe, scientists estimate that there are anywhere between 100 billion and 200 billion galaxies like ours. That is just, that's just mind-boggling big. But science can tell us those kind of things. but it cannot answer other types of questions. And so you and I are free to explore some of these other questions through philosophy, through theology, through experience, through history, those kind of things. And there's no conflict. There needs to be no conflict there. So I've intentionally been very general in my comments tonight, and this has been on purpose. I imagine, and I actually hope, that I've raised more questions than I've answered, and that's a good thing. And so my hope is there will be a time to either deal with that in the tables with the table talks or in the Q&A. But to end, I just want to summarize by saying I want to summarize with a quote by Robert Millikan, who was the man responsible for determining the charge of the electron. Right, so he was pretty instrumental in our contemporary understanding of the world. And so he says this. He says, "This much I can say with definiteness, namely that there is no scientific basis for the denial of religion. Nor is there, in my judgment, any excuse for a conflict between science and religion, for their fields are entirely different. Men who know very little of science and men who know very little of religion do indeed get to quarreling, and the onlookers imagine that there is a conflict between science and religion, whereas the conflict is only between two different species of ignorance." Yikes. Thank you.